Hi everyone, this is the lecture on human variation. Sorry. Okay, so before we get started on this though, just wanted to remind you guys about the syllabus quiz. That's on Wednesday. So I'm recording this on Monday. You might not watch this until Wednesday. So if you're, logging into Canvas and you're starting to watch this video right now and you're like, oh, I totally forgot about the syllabus quiz. Remember, you have all day. It opens at 7 a.m. and it's open until 11:59. You have 30 minutes. It's timed. You have 30 minutes, but it shouldn't take you longer than 10 minutes probably. Obviously, like I said before, you can have the syllabus in front of you. I expect you to have the syllabus in front of you, either like in a Word document on your computer or a printed copy out. The point is not for you guys to memorize the syllabus. It's for you to understand that for any question that you might have during the semester, you are going to be able to find that the answer to that question in the syllabus. That's the whole point of the syllabus quiz. Okay, but to get on with the PowerPoint. Okay. Slide 2. Okay. So a monogenism versus polygenism. So if you recall, we were talking before about Darwin and like the pre-Darwinian thought, like those scientists who came before him, who either he kind of built his ideas on or was inspired by, or just other thinkers, in terms of like biology and changes through time and these different ideas that people had. So we talked about that. So it's important to kind of think in terms of like that historical context. So the okay, so basically for these two, they're at the time. So imagine, like before we were talking about 150 years ago, 200 years ago. Imagine the same time that there were scientists trying to understand and explain the world and humans as well. And many of them, although not correct, many of them, like pre-Darwin, had ideas about stuff. Like they were starting, like I mentioned before, they were realizing that animals, like when they were digging up bones, they were realizing animals that used to exist no longer existed. They looked similar to animals that do exist. So they're realizing there's some kind of change over time. They're not understanding the mechanism. But now suddenly they're having all these questions. And they start thinking about this in terms of humans, at least like sort of. So there was this recognition that obviously you can imagine this too if you're thinking about humans in general. There's a lot of variation. So recall we talked about variation before being very important. So when you recognize that there's a lot of variation among humans, as these scientists attempted to kind of explain the origins of that, sometimes from a religious perspective, but not necessarily always. But they thought, okay, and remember this is important, that at the time they are not really realizing the way we understand now that the world is much older than it is. So they're thinking, okay, the world's only this, so many thousands of years old. We have this wide range of variation among humans for multiple things. How do we explain that with this short period of time? Does that imply that there must have been kind of like a human origin, like multiple events, whether like supernatural or biological, or was it one? So these are those two kind of schools of thought. Moving on to slide 2. So this gets into this term race. So in anthropology, we don't use this term race, and I want to tell you why. So we use this term, you'll see it on the second bullet point, it's ancestry. And these are slightly different terms, but it's an important distinction, and I want to explain why. So in terms of the word race, historically, this references something called racial typology. Racial typology. And what this concept is that people can, let me see if I can do it this way. People can be grouped into separate and distinct categories. So like say you have a group of people here. They have their own types of behaviors, a specific religion, they look a certain way, a certain level of intelligence, like, and so on and so forth. Then you have another group, and the same thing, they look a certain way, they act a certain way, their behaviors, intelligence, religion, whatever it is. And here's another group, and the same thing, same thing, same thing. Well, of course, we know that's not how it works. That's not how, especially like for, a lot of things in life and in the world, that's not how it works. But it's definitely not how it works when we're talking about like human groups. they're not separate and distinct categories this way. This is not a correct thing, which is why we don't use this term. What it ends up looking more like is something like this. So where you could say, okay, yeah, sure, there's one group here with their particular behaviors, culture, whatever it is, and here's another group, and there's overlap. And well, here's another group, and here's another group. And this is especially true, this is what the point of this term ancestry, this is specifically and especially true when talking about our physical appearance. We cannot be grouped into separate and distinct categories based on what we look like, whether it's height or hair color or, obviously skin tone, like any physical feature you can think of. We can't be grouped into separate and distinct categories because that's just not how it works. You can find tall people in many parts of the world. It's not like it only occurs in one area. People with really light skin, you're going to find that different parts of the world. It's not as if it occurs in just one specific area. That's not how it works. But in terms of the word ancestry, we use this in anthropology because we do recognize that because of evolutionary adaptations, people clearly look different based on where they're from, like in the past. So, like for us now, we have a very globalized world, but imagine, thousands, if not millions of years ago, that's not what was happening. People, for generation after generation, thousands and thousands, if not millions of years, stayed in the same locations. And so after generations, they become adapted to those areas. So the term ancestry implies that concept, that we understand that historically, evolutionarily, people had lived and became adapted to very specific areas. And so when we're looking at modern people today, we say, yeah, we have a very globalized world. People live all over the place, but we recognize that there are physical adaptations to where their ancestry was. So ancestry, not the same thing as race in terms of what I said, like that historical idea of race, not the same thing. But ancestry recognizes we cannot be grouped into distinct and separate categories, but we clearly have some differences based on those adaptations to those specific environments of the past. Okay, so you can see an example of this on slide 4. This is for skin color. So you'll see that it's not as if, really light skin or medium tone, or like it doesn't occur in one area of the world. And if we were in class, I would ask, does anyone notice a pattern to this? Usually someone gets it right. If we're looking at like closest to the equator, this idea of being closer to, like having more UV radiation, sun exposure, having darker or lighter skin, depending on how much you're getting, is going to be very adaptive. So I think I have an example of that in a minute. We'll get into that in a second. But, okay, so moving on to slide number 5. Adaptations. So we briefly talked about this before when we were talking about Darwin and natural selection. So we'll just go over some more examples of this. So adaptation, so you can see here this little picture of this bunny, very fluffy. Think about why that would be beneficial for that animal given the environment. Now I know it's a small picture, but you can clearly see the environment that this individual rabbit is in, right? It's very snowy, cold, having more, depending on the animal, having more hair or fur is going to be very beneficial or adaptive in that really cold environment. But also look at the coloring. Obviously, if you're living in a place where there's lots of snow and you have very dark hair or fur, you're going to stand out to predators. Or if you are a predator, the other animals maybe you're trying to hunt might see you coming. So you're going to notice that for multiple animals, they're going to be able to blend in better with the environment, whether it's, white hair or fur in the snow, or like we talked about before, like desert hares having, the grays and the browns to blend in more. So recall, like I said, we talked about this before, but this is depending on the environment. Certain traits are going to be more beneficial given that particular environment. And the list goes on about what we mean by environment is, and I have some bullet points here, whether it's very hot or cold, how much or how little sun exposure you're getting, what's the altitude, the food resources. Maybe you're in an area that has a lot of marine resources. Maybe you have a lot of fruit resources or a lot of animal, that all has to do with the environment and the factors of the environment. Okay, slide 6. So there's something called Bergmans Rule. Very simple right here in the bullet points. The colder the climate, the larger the torso. Basically, and you can see here's a picture of this. So this is going to decrease heat dissipation. The whole point is that if you're living in a very cold environment, what are the ways your body can be, what ways can the shape of the body be more beneficial to you or adaptive to retain heat in that very cold environment? Because at that point, in that type of environment, that could mean the difference between living or dying. Slide 7, Allen's rule, it's kind of a similar concept, that in warmer environments, the limbs, so the arms and the legs are going to be longer. That's going to be able to dissipate heat. It's going to create more surface area for that. Bergmans and Allen's rule. Okay, slide 8. Oh, I knew it was on here. I said I was going to get back to it. Okay, so if we're talking about sun exposure, oh man, I'm sorry guys, I just like completely blanked. The level of sun exposure and whether your skin is very light to very dark or any range in between, those two things are going to be connected to each other. So here I have an example. For those with darker skin, this is going to be beneficial for a few different reasons. So here you can see this list of bullet points. It's going to aid in the decrease of UV radiation exposure. So if you're living in an area where you're going to get more sun exposure, having slightly darker skin or very darker skin is going to be very beneficial because, as many of you know, what does UV radiation often cause? Skin cancers. Now, like in 2020, we could say, well, skin cancer, you know, while it can be very serious, people obviously, like we know people die from that. We have modern medicine, but imagine a time where that wasn't the case. Most of our ancestry, most of our past. So being able to have an adaptation to your skin that's going to allow you to have a barrier to that in some way, or at least decrease your chances of getting it, is going to be very beneficial to you. Another thing about, so it's not just skin cancer that you have to be cautious of with UV radiation. Also, it can cause the breakdown of folate, which can lead to anemia, and this is often responsible for, and there's this term here, spontaneous abortion. So if I were to ask you in class, usually someone would know the answer to this. Like, what is the more common term we use for that? So think about it for a second. Pause the video if you want. So the term we would use in like common conversation would be miscarriage. So this can happen. Now, if we're thinking about this in terms of like evolution, reproduction, this whole process, if there's something that's causing you to not be able to produce offspring, that's going to be a major problem. And those who, because always consider that there's going to be variation, those who have that slight protection against that, to where that's not going to happen to them, obviously it's directly related, they're going to be able to pass on those genes if they can have offspring, versus the others who cannot. Go to slide 9. So this is in contrast to, so kind of the same idea, but imagine you're in an area that doesn't have a lot of sun exposure. This can also be a problem too. So what we're gonna see as individuals is going to be adaptive to have slightly lighter skin, because that's going to aid in vitamin D absorption. So I want to say, like, as we're talking about like this vitamin or that vitamin or this deficiency or that deficiency, I think for us now, we think like that's really uncommon, that doesn't really happen. This is true because a lot of our foods are fortified. They don't naturally come that way unless you're eating unless you eat all like whole grains, fruits, vegetables, like a raw diet or very whole foods diet. You might be getting all this naturally, but a lot of our foods are fortified with this stuff, which is why, like in the United States, you rarely see individuals with like severe vitamin deficiencies. It doesn't really happen. Like, of course, given there might be like a medical condition or something. But vitamin D, so we often think of this in terms of, we often don't think of this in terms of bone health. We usually think of calcium. But vitamin D also aids in the absorption of calcium. So having a vitamin D deficiency can also cause your body to not absorb calcium the way it should, which can lead to problems with your bones. So for me, and maybe for some of you, like, I think that the recommendation, like, for women is probably to start, I really couldn't tell you, like, it's probably younger now than it used to be, like a calcium supplement. So women, as you get older, males and females, you will start to have some bone loss, but it tends to affect females a little bit more. So often females are told, like, at an earlier age, like, start, taking some calcium supplements. But often what you'll see, and if you've never seen this before, like now when you go to the store, like, just look for it, because you'll be like, oh, I see what she's talking about. Often when you see calcium supplements, it'll say calcium plus D, because that's going to help. I have to take this. So I said this before, that I'll give you guys multiple examples throughout the semester of, like, my cancer treatment and some of the stuff. But with going through the medications that I've been going through and being in menopause, like, they have to be very concerned about my bones and bone health. And so I'm on calcium plus D and some other medications too. But this can be a problem. Like I said before, now in 2020, modern medicine, especially living in a major metropolitan city, we have access to physicians and medications and treatment of many kinds. But imagine a time when this didn't exist, that having brittle bones or having a problem with bone development when you're very young can be a major problem and a major hindrance in terms of whether you are able to feed yourself or feed your family or be able to reproduce at all. So always think of it in terms of, like, what's going on, like, over long periods of time evolutionarily in the past. So as an extreme example of this, you'll see this picture that not enough vitamin D can cause a condition called osteomalacia, or you might have heard the term rickets. So when this happens, it still happens. It can still happen in the world in 2020. It's probably a little more rare, like in, here, like in Las Vegas, let's say. But it can definitely still happen. Typically when we see this, it's when, so, like, I kind of have to back up a little bit. Okay. As your bones are developing, let me back up even more. How many of you, imagine I'm assuming most of you probably have, like, held a newborn, or maybe have seen a newborn, or maybe even, like, let's say under a year old. When you look at a small human like that, their limbs look kind of bent. Do you ever notice that? They're kind of bent, or they appear to be, like, curved in some way. That's because they're still forming. Like, we, as adults, when you look at our bones, they're like a solid bone. But for children, they're still, even after birth, they're still forming. So they're actually, like, in pieces. There's cartilage attaching a lot of it, but it's still forming. And while it's going through that process, if something goes wrong and they don't get enough vitamins or something, that formation might end up not occurring correctly, and suddenly then they're stuck with that, malformed bone for the rest of their lives. For osteomalacia, or a severe vitamin D deficiency, usually when we see this is in children who they aren't getting enough vitamin D in their diet as, like, children, and very likely while they were gestating, they also didn't get, like, their mother wasn't getting enough when she was pregnant. But like I said before, like in 2020, especially, like, if we're thinking about, like, our community, Las Vegas, is going to be much more rare, because what ends up happening is, women who are pregnant typically go on some kind of, like, prenatal vitamin to ensure that they're getting all those proper nutrients. But it still can happen, and it definitely happens in other parts of the world. And I have a picture of this. So slide 10, you'll see on the right, there's the x-ray. You'll see the picture. The bones have, didn't get the nutrients that they needed, and so they started to form, and they eventually formed into a bone, but it's not the typical bone, and that's very unfortunate. You can see on the left the picture of what those individuals' legs would look like, and that's going to cause problems with them walking, probably going to cause some pain as well, and it's not as if they can just start taking a bunch of vitamin D or calcium and that's going to fix it. That's not going to happen. So this goes back to what we're saying, I'm sorry, on slide 9, with light skin, being able to absorb that vitamin D is going to be very beneficial in those areas where there's not a lot of sun exposure. Being able to get the nutrients that you can from it, vitamin D, is going to be very beneficial to you. Okay. You know, I've got some other stuff on this PowerPoint, and I think, you know, I think we're just going to skip that. Let's keep this one short. I'm tired. You're probably tired, right?